Tonight, we're going to be speaking about protecting your organization from the risks of litigation. We're going to get into a little bit of a story, and then we're going to get into some specific examples. So the type of litigation risk that I'm going to be talking about first of all is the actions of other people in other organizations, or the actions of your employees and your volunteers in your organization, and how your organization can be ultimately responsible for those actions. And you can be liable in lawsuits, and you might have to pay some damages to people. So let's start off with a story. Going back to the beginning of Canada. In 1898, there was an organization called the Christian Brothers of Ireland. And that year, they expanded into Newfoundland, which was not then part of Canada, actually. The Christian Brothers operated hundreds of schools and orphanages around the world, and they did this for the Roman Catholic Church. So I'm just going to call it the church, okay? They built an orphanage on land that was donated by the Archbishop of St. John's, Newfoundland, they operated this orphanage for a number of years. Now, for about 40 years, from 1949, and I'm going to advance my slides here so we start there. So this study that we're doing is called the Mount Cashel case, okay? So for about 40 years, from 1949 to 1989, some employees of the Christian Brothers, which were operating this orphanage called the Mount Cashel Orphanage in Newfoundland, they did some pretty terrible things. They sexually and physically assaulted children who were under their care. In the early 1990s, this came out, okay? We were in a culture before of everyone was keeping quiet. But then in the 90s, it came out, and it was discovered that about at least 300 young people, orphanage residents, were abused in this manner. So at that time, it started in the 90s, that the victims, they brought a number of lawsuits. Not all the same, but they brought a number of lawsuits against the Christian Brothers, against the Roman Catholic Church, and also against the province of Newfoundland. In 1997, the Newfoundland government decided that it was better for them to settle. So they acknowledged their responsibility. And what was their responsibility? Their responsibility was that they operated the social services organizations in the province. And those organizations recommended and sent children to the Mount Cashel orphanage. And so they recognized that they had a responsibility in this. So they paid a settlement of approximately $11.25 million. So over $11 million to approximately 40 residents. Remember I said there was 300, so there's a number of them who haven't received any settlement. So then the Newfoundland government, they wanted to recover the money that they paid, and so they brought a lawsuit against the Christian Brothers to recover their costs. So the Christian Brothers, they were forced to sell their land and the orphanage, as well as several other schools that they operated. So between 1996 and 2004, the Christian Brothers paid $27 million in compensation to about 100 victims from the Mount Cashel orphanage. Then in 2011, that's a lot of money that they had to pay out. Of course, they had to declare bankruptcy. So in 2011, the Christian Brothers declared bankruptcy, and they sold the rest of their property in Canada, and basically they stopped operations in Canada. Then in July of 2020, so now we're coming up to sort of modern history, modern times right now, the Newfoundland and Labrador Court of Appeal, they had a case, and they said that the Roman Catholic Archdiocese was vicariously liable for the sexual abuse committed by the Christian Brothers at the Mount Cashel Orphanage. So that word, okay, let's remember that, vicariously liable. I'm going to go into that. I'm going to explain that a little bit, but that's the important legal principle we're talking about. So now the victims could receive compensation from the Roman Catholic Diocese of Newfoundland, from the Roman Catholic Church in Newfoundland. So in July of 2021, the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Newfoundland sold off multiple schools and churches in Canada to pay victims. When I first, heard about this case, and I heard about this case through a client of ours who said, well, we've got to do some reorganization because of this case. There's no point in having, let's say, 5 different corporations. We can't shield our assets. We have to we're going to have an umbrella corporation. So I found out about this case, and I did some research. And if you do some Google research, yourself, and you look about the church, the Roman Catholic Church, selling off property in the Maritime provinces, in Newfoundland, in Nova Scotia, you're going to see that it devastated communities. There were communities who had built their churches, and they had to sell them off to fund the settlements for this. Of course, that was terrible. So how did it get to this point? How did the activities at one orphanage lead to the shutting down of hundreds of Roman Catholic churches and schools? So we've talked about this principle of vicarious liability. That means that one person or one organization is responsible for the actions of another person. So as an example, if one of your volunteers accidentally damages somebody's property while helping out at an event, maybe they're parking cars or something like that. If they damage that car, then your organization could be responsible for that damage. That's how this principle of vicarious liability comes into effect. So this principle, liability for someone else, it occurs where there's a relationship between the organization and the person who caused the harm. It could be a volunteer, it could be an employee, it could be a director. And so this principle is in place. Courts have put this principle in place for fairness, because if somebody gets hurt, damaged, and they go after, let's say in court, the individual who caused the damage, oftentimes that individual has no assets. They're maybe not poor, but they don't have the kind of assets to cover this. And that's why the courts permit the person who has been hurt to go after the organization, or as we saw in the Mount Cashel case, even another organization. So the Archdiocese let's discuss a little bit about what the court said. Why did this happen? The Archdiocese had a close and ongoing relationship with the Christian Brothers. It was the Archdiocese, the Catholic Church, which invited the Christian Brothers to come from Ireland to set up an orphanage. The Catholic Church gave them the duties, gave them the mandate, told them what to do. Yes, the Christian Brothers, then they operated it by themselves, but the Christian brothers were furthering the religious and social purposes of the Catholic Church, and so this is why the church was responsible for the actions of the Christian brothers. So the court also looked at standard of care. When the church found out about these 300 people who had been violated and abused in this way, when they found out, what did the church do? Okay, so the church took action. So the court said, okay, you acted appropriately. You took action. You did things. You put things in place. You put policies in place. They said, but that was not enough to protect them from this principle of vicarious liability. Okay, so that's very important. It wasn't enough that they did things afterwards. They should have done things before. So, what are some takeaways from the case? An organization is responsible for the improper actions of an employee or a volunteer or a director. The loss is going to be placed on the party that introduced the risk, that brought the risk into existence. And courts are going to look at how much power or control your organization has over not just volunteers, but also agents. And that is also important in the Ukrainian community because we have projects, let's say, overseas in Ukraine, and we have to have direction and control over the projects. So this becomes important for you. You can now start to see where this principle of vicarious liability is something you should be concerned about. So if your organization gives people position of trust or authority over vulnerable people, such as children, the elderly, people with disabilities, you may be held liable, your organization may be held liable if that trust is abused. So charities, organizations must have robust training, supervision, and reporting systems in place, and policies must be enforced. So the type of measures that you need to put in place are, recognizing and dealing with instances where an employee could abuse their power, preventing situations that increase risk of improper conduct or improper conduct. You want to discourage wrongful acts that achieve the organization's goals. So what does that mean? Okay, so the wrongful act, let's say, was maybe beating children so that they would comply and be obedient. Well, maybe that achieves the goal of the organization, but they're doing a wrongful act. They should not be beating children so that they're compliant and, okay? The organization has to handle and resolve issues even before. So you have to be mindful of situations that could lead to wrongful acts. And you want to balance the power of employees in relation to potential victims. So again, establishing a code of conduct, not just creating a code of conduct, but having check-ins, having meetings with employees to really see what's going on, to not just let somebody carry out a program for years without checking in and supervision. Very important. You've got to establish a safe and confidential method for potential victims to report. They have to feel that they can report these actions. You've got to put in place screening policies. So implement policies that focus on preventative measures, and that will go a long way to protect your organization from litigation risk, from this kind of risk. Okay, so I'm going to talk very quickly about other kinds of risks and where areas you need to comply with. You've got to think about your contracts. If you've got employment contracts, they must be up to date with the correct legislation and the correct practices. Agreements, ensure that you've got proper tracking, CRA compliance, strong record keeping, because if you cause your organization to lose its charitable status, that's a big risk, and you certainly don't want donors to be getting angry at your organization because you've lost your charitable status. Lease agreements, that's another type of agreement that a lot of organizations have to deal with. Make sure that it's properly drafted. Make sure that you're respecting your lease, because if you don't, that can lead to a day in court. Make sure you've got your tax compliance. Here's an important one. Use written agreements for all of your partnerships, your agents, your contractors. Make sure that it's very clear. Everyone in Canada, in Ontario, has an obligation to act in good faith. The courts have talked about this, and it's not just acting in good faith in your day-to-day, but it's also acting in good faith in your contract, drafting your contract, or terminating your contract, discipline measures on your contract. So there's an obligation to act in good faith. There's also something to be remembered is that, as an organization and your directors, you've got a fiduciary duty to the organization. So it's not if the board or if a director feels upset at somebody or angry at somebody, you have to be careful in your contractual relations, that you respect the law, that you respect your contracts, because, of course, in Canada, a written contract must be respected. If it's not, it can lead you into court. So the final point that I will say about other areas of risk are making sure that your bylaws are up to date, making sure that your meetings have proper resolutions, because all of these things, if they're not done properly, they can lead to they can lead to litigation risk. You can have people, members, directors. If things are not done properly, they can be upset. And we had a case a few years ago in the community, not too long ago, which went all the way up to the Court of Appeal, because there was a fight, there was a dispute on the board of a local organization, a school, and it cost tens of thousands in legal fees. So very important to make sure that you're acting appropriately with your bylaws and your meetings and those sorts of things. Okay, so now it's time, if there are any, for questions. We have somebody in the back, and one of our mic runners is going to give you that mic. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, my name is Steve, and the question that I have is progressive legal issues, like when you're mentioning Mount Cashel. Don't say anything, don't talk, don't tell. That was the order of the day way back then. And I understand how the church kind of pushed things away. Moving forward to today, like in the nature of my work, I have to have errors and omission insurance. How do you put a value on E&O that you might want to get for your organization, to the point where sometimes that risk liability bankrupts you before you even start? So how do you make a balance between covering your liabilities, but also making sure that you could still function?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's almost as though you were up here beside me, because that was the point that I skipped over. So absolutely. It's, that's another thing is insurance. So there's different types of insurance that you can consider. There's employment practices liability insurance. I hadn't even heard of that one. There's, of course, directors and officers liability insurance. You want to have that for your board. Many people will not, and I agree with this, will not go on a board unless they know that there's what we call D&O insurance, directors and officers insurance. Commercial liability insurance. You're renting a place, make sure you have proper insurance if somebody slips and falls on your premises, or if an icicle falls from the roof of the building that you're renting in, or make sure, or you own perhaps, make sure that you have proper commercial liability. So that's part of the balance you were talking about, that you do have to invest, some of the funds that you're raising into insurance.